In episode 4 of Star Wars, which you all know is the actual first episode of Star Wars, there's this really compelling story that develops with Luke as the underdog, who is sent careening into this adventure of confrontation with the biggest and most oppressive regime in his world. Most of you probably know that George Lucas didn't make up this type of story just, on the fly. He was actually using a template for stories called The Hero's Journey, which has often been used in many of our most popular dramatic and melodramatic stories about an underdog hero who gains allies, who's sent into an adventure, and who eventually conquers a much larger enemy or force. These types of stories can be really cathartic, especially during a faith journey, because we feel like we are that underdog that has suddenly been sent careening into this huge adventure and conflict with a much, much larger, more oppressive system. And it's really helpful to have these types of stories to help process our emotions. However, there is a weakness with these types of stories. And that is that even though they are emotionally compelling and very cathartic to watch, and they do have very seemingly direct parallels into our own lives, they tend to skip over the historical reality that whenever there has been an underdog person or an underdog organization or an underdog group of people who have toppled a much larger, more oppressive regime, the new people, the former underdogs who come into power, tend to become just as bad, if not worse, than the previous regime that they were trying to get rid of. There are lots of examples of this, from the French Revolution to the Bolshevik Revolution. Just about every country has some kind of example of this. And what I want to point out is that addressing a violent system with more violence, while it can topple that violent system, doesn't typically lead overall to more peace, to more kindness, to more compassion, to more forgiveness. Violence is the prime tool of cult mind control and especially of the cult of patriarchy. Because when you are in a violent mindset, you're in a fear-based mindset, you're in a scarcity-based mindset, you're in us versus them mindset. Creating a war is the best way of triggering a patriarchal cult mindset. Which is why they pretty much all do it, especially the church. Every general conference, you're going to hear people comparing this world or our lives to a battleground or to a war. But to try and dismantle that, or to try and undo that damage by treating it like a violent battleground or a war, is actually like Luke using, the dark side to try and defeat the dark side. You're actually just feeding in to this system that creates violent patriarchalism. When I look at the history of LDS saints, from the very beginning when they were selling everything that they had in order to buy a ticket to get on a boat that would cross the Atlantic and then hitch up a hand cart and pull it across the plains to Utah, or to the modern day pioneers in places like Africa and Russia and South America, who are also giving up their whole social network, their life savings sometimes, in order to join the church. I feel like one of the most vivid and compelling ideas that motivates this type of action is the idea of Zion. And I love the descriptions of Zion that come forward from places like 4th Nephi, where people have all things in common. They don't have to worry about scarcity anymore. They don't have to worry about poverty anymore, because everybody's just willing to share. And they attempted to do things like this in the early church, but it always kind of backfired with things like the Consecrated Order or the Order of Enoch, because it was an attempt to impose top-down a sense of unity and commonality between things. The ideas about Zion and about a utopian society were not unique to Joseph Smith. There were a lot of utopian communities in the early and the mid-19th century. And that's a really interesting bit of history too, if you go and look into it. And that even continued into the 20th century with things like communism or socialism, that people had this idea that they could achieve this unity among people that would have no violence, there would be no poor among them, there would be just a pure, industrious coexistence with other people. Are humans capable of something like that, of creating a society or community like that that doesn't turn destructive on its members? I don't know. It seems like with so many test runs and so little success, so little authentic success in which everyone in the community was able to feel self-actualized and valued in that community instead of oppressed or regulated. It seems, I don't know, maybe a little unlikely. Maybe there's some human weaknesses that we just won't be able to overcome. Whether or not that ever does happen in the real world, though, it was a prime motivator for me during my faith deconstruction, because one of the things that really bothered me was finding out that our supposedly Zionistic community was not supporting people. It was not fair to people. It was not protecting the marginalized. It was not protecting the people who needed help. It wasn't funneling resources to those who were the poor and needy. And I was like, the Zion that I wanted would have done those things. The Zion that the church talks about would do those things. So now on this side of the deconstruction, I have the choice to either be jaded about this goal completely or to transfer it onto a new model. Since I don't know if it's possible for humans to do this on a grand scale, I kind of decided to stop waiting for governments or churches or anything else to make it happen. And I've adopted a model that I think will best help me to approach a utopian relationship with as many people as possible. And I want to share some of those things with you so that if this is still a compelling idea for you, or if you miss the unity and community of being in the church, maybe some of these ideas will help you to create a unified community outside of the church. And not just a unified community, but a community that actually exhibits fairness and justice and love towards every member of the community, rather than imposing a top-down structure that will keep those who are in power and keep those who are not in power disempowered. My model is like 3 basic components. Maybe a 3-legged stool is a good visual. The first leg being curiosity. I think it's super important in these deconstruction moments to recognize how valuable curiosity has been to you. Get curious about other people. Get curious about their experiences. Get curious about the assumptions that are coming into play for you. Get curious about the historical record. What records and what evidence do we have? What does that evidence indicate? How has that information been used or applied in our current system or in your current paradigm? Then get curious about your own reactions to the stories or the histories or the things that you see and hear. What does that tell you about yourself and where you're coming from? What does that indicate about how you are addressing the situation? Second leg of the stool is compassion, or in other words, humanizing everyone in the situation. I like to just ask the question over and over again, why did this action make sense to this person? This helps to prevent the oversimplification of other people and of pigeonholing them into certain actions or to dismissing them as evil. Like, I think the vast majority of people are trying to do the right thing, and there are sociopaths and psychopaths out there. You should be on your guard about those, be on your guard about affinity fraud and other things, but asking the questions of how you can humanize the other people in the situation, whether it's a historical situation or a current day situation, will really help you get farther in understanding the people around you and treating the needs of the whole. Third, and I think most important, is creativity. Creativity is the key to metabolizing the pain or the mistakes that you've made in the past and using those to fuel your new future. It's also key to liberating yourself and freeing yourself to make the world that you want to live in. To finish off this thought about a new hope, or like a hope for the future post-deconstructing Mormonism, I want to read you this chapter from the Tao Te Ching, which, by the way, is one of the best books I've ever read, and so it's really like not very long. Go read the Tao Te Ching. It's so interesting. Okay, so this is from chapter 8. It's on goodness. It says, "True goodness is like water. It nurtures everything and harms nothing. Like water, it ever seeks the lowest place, the place that all others avoid. This is the way of the Tao. For a dwelling, it chooses the quiet meadow. For a heart, the circling eddy. In generosity, it is kind. In speech, it is sincere. In power, it is order. In action, it is gentle. In movement, it is rhythm. Because it is always peaceable, it soothes and refreshes." You probably recognize some of these themes as coming from the New Testament too. Not necessarily that they were related from the same source material, but I think that a lot of philosophers have just noticed similar things that lead to healthy, balanced living. Some of the things that I think are really compelling here are that there doesn't need to be a God figure in order for these ideas to feel compelling, in order for these ideas to feel resonant with us as humans. I think that in general, most of us want to be good and we want to be nurturing to other humans. We want to be valued members of our community. And the way to do that gets kind of scrambled when we are in these cult mindset environments, because we're told that in order to be valued members of our community, we need to lie to protect the good name of the church, or we need to cover up for the sins of our leaders, or we need to do X, Y, and Z that aren't necessarily ethical. And one of the things that I love about the Tao Te Ching and about this chapter in particular is that it emphasizes that there is an order to things. There is a rhythm to things, that there is sense to the universe, and that sense doesn't have to be something that we understand. It doesn't have to be something that we can encapsulate and package up and sell as a missionary. It doesn't even have to be something that we're necessarily super conscious of. That anyone who lives according to the principles of being sincere, being kind, being gentle, working with the rhythms of what you have, can live a good life, can live a happy life, can live in harmony with the people around them, can do good for the world, can maybe even change the world for the better. So going forward, I'm going to be trying to make Zion still, but I'm not calling it Zion anymore, and I'm not using the same vocabulary that was used in the church to define that idea. But I do have a new hope that it will work out. Recently, I've been watching a lot of videos from Bizarro Ward, who is so interesting because he compares Joseph Smith to other 19th century cult leaders, and he compares the modern church to other modern cults like Scientology and Jehovah's Witnesses and others. And the main takeaway is that the church is really not original at all. Kind of disappointing for me, because that was like one of the last things I was holding on to, because I was like, well, even if it's not true, at least it was creative. And it turns out it wasn't that either. And this thing happened to me yesterday with one of my kids that I thought illustrated this point really well. See, my child brought to me this drawing. And when I asked what the drawing was, she was like, it's a bumper. It's got teeth like this, and it's like a candy cane, and it's gonna come and eat you. And I thought, whoa, that is so interesting and creative, and like how creepy and weird. How did you come up with that? And she was like, oh, I don't know, and she didn't really answer. So then she drew this picture of like two people being, surrounded and attacked by these bumper candy cane things. And I was like, wow, where is this coming from in her mind? Like, what a creative blending of all of these things. Candy canes and a phobia of monsters and like bumpers, who knows where that came from. And then there's this cave where the people are hiding. Like, where did she get all this? So I went through most of the day thinking that my child was just super, like, phenomenally prodigy level creative for being, as young as she is. And then my husband told me that last night he had told them a story about his childhood, and how in his childhood his sibling had been close to the back end of a car, and that his parent had said, hey, watch out for the bumper, and that in his sibling's mind the bumper had been this scary candy cane thing with teeth that was going to come and terrorize them. And he didn't know what a bumper was, and so he just spent a lot of his childhood being afraid of bumpers. And once I knew that context, these pictures completely made sense, because I was like, oh, my child was trying to illustrate this concept that she was hearing from my husband. But before I knew my husband's context, before I knew that he had told this story to her, I had no idea that she hadn't just made it up out of whole cloth. And I think that this story with my child really illustrates the necessity to learn about 19th century culture, especially early 19th century, when Joseph Smith's brain stew was really forming. Because Because the more you learn about Joseph Smith's context and the books, people, schooling, environment that he was in, the more you realize how typical he was. Raise your hand if you know what the word millenarianism means. The LDS Church has a strong history of being in the apocalyptic mindset because we've been waiting for the second coming for at least 180-ish years. In my experience, the LDS mainstream version of millenarianism looks something like what's described in this book. For others, it takes a darker turn, such as the scenario of Joanne, as described in the first 2 episodes of this new podcast by Tyler Measum, who's also the director of Murder Among the Mormons, by the way, in which Joanne is sucked into a millenarian polygamist cult in Manti, Utah, a splinter group of the LDS Church. What I think is interesting about millenarianism, or the apocalyptic mindset, or expecting the world to end and so you have to buy up guns and bunkers and food storage and blah, 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 all that stuff, is that this is absolutely typical for cult mindsets. And it is very expected that cult leaders will introduce this type of thinking to their followers. And that this type of thinking is key to capturing well-educated followers for your cult. This is kind of a detailed process, so if you want more information, definitely check out this book by Stephen Hassan, Combating Cult Mind Control. But essentially, when a leader or a writer or whoever introduces the apocalyptic mindset, the millenarianism, into their group, they bring a fear-based mindset to their followers, which shuts down some of their cognitive processing. They're not able to make rational decisions at the same level as if they were not in this fear-based mindset. This is because the chemistry of your brain is such that your brain is always going to value survival above rationality. And so if a leader can introduce a threat that is severe enough or impending enough or grand enough that they can put you into a fear-based mindset, they can shut down some of your cognitive rational thinking. And if they put the price of survival as being giving them money, obeying their ideas, following them into Manti, Utah, or whatever, then they've got you. And this works even on educated people, and perhaps even better on educated people than uneducated people, because usually highly educated people think that they are invulnerable to this type of manipulation. And it is a big reason that educated LDS people might not be able to leave, because they can't get out of that phobia-based mindset. Millenarianism has personal application for my husband and I, because while we lived in Utah, I read the Visions of Glory book that I referenced in the last video, and I started going into this mindset. And I have like a master's degree, so I was also one of the educated people for whom the fear mindset was working, the parasitic organism of cult thinking was attaching itself through this fear-based mindset. And after reading Visions of Glory, I knew that a lot of people were not taking it seriously. But the fear-based mindset was fueled by my doctrinal beliefs in the LDS Church, because we do believe that Jesus is about to come. We do believe that there are going to be, these huge cataclysmic apocalyptic events of the last days that are going to precede the coming of Christ. We do believe in the LDS Church that these things are going to be really fantastical and beyond our comprehension while we're living our stable, normal lives. Thus, even though I knew that the Visions of Glory book wasn't being taken seriously, and I was trying the whole time to be okay, so we don't know, if this is exactly going to happen, but it is an interesting visualization of what it might look like. I was going through those mental gymnastics to try and figure out why I felt so compelled by this fear that was being introduced by the Visions of Glory book. And yet I couldn't disarm those fears doctrinally. And since my doctrinal and theological beliefs were kind of the deepest part of of my paradigm, I could not dismiss the fears that were being introduced by things like Visions of Glory or by Julie Rowe, who I started to listen to after that. And my husband and I had multiple conversations after listening to podcasts or reading books or reading articles or going to conferences in which people were talking about like the end times astrology that was showing that Jupiter was in such a position that showed that Christ was going to come back and blah, 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 blah. True story. After we had a bunch of these conversations, I was like, should we be selling all that we have in order to buy food storage and like a transportable tent to go live in a tent city and like maybe an underground bunker to survive a nuclear explosion or something? This is really crazy to me now to be remembering this, because this was in like 2013, 2012. And this is not uncommon for a lot of LDS people to be sucked into this spiral of like, should I be taking this more seriously? Should I be more worried about this? And often as we're leaving the church or in the post-Mormon space, these fears come back to haunt us, which we'll talk about processing next. Okay, so let's get down to the real work of deconstructing some of our millenarianism. Step 1 in the deconstruction process is always to know exactly what it is you're deconstructing. So it helps to do some kind of free write or some kind of list to consolidate where it is that you're getting your millenariist ideas from. If it's church manuals, if it's the Book of Isaiah, if it's the Book of Mormon, if it's the New Testament, if it's general conference talks, maybe it's all of those things. But consolidate your sources so that you know exactly what it is you're deconstructing. Then start to look for patterns. I found that happens to be one of the most effective ways for me to deconstruct, is to realize that like the structure that the church built for me, which it said was so exceptional, so extraordinary, so original, so true, is actually totally ordinary, totally typical to all cult structures. I found that reading books, especially in the LDS tradition, like Educated by Tara Westover, has been really helpful in identifying the types of patterns that are showing up in the cult mindset and that are prevalent even in mainstream LDS thought. And watching someone like Tara Westover deconstruct those ideas and come to a healthier place can really help you in going through your own journey of deconstruction too. Because my beliefs were so doctrinally founded and so intellectual in nature, I found that it was really helpful to go that route too, to not just read personal stories, although those were helpful, but also just to like saturate myself in so much literature. So that's where we get Combating Cult Mind Control. I just got this new book, which I'll return and report on, called Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, which is about the techniques that Chinese communists use to indoctrinate followers. Then there are more doctrinally based things like a New Testament, which gives a very different perspective on the history of Christianity and the personhood of Christ and what he was saying when he was talking about the millennium or about resurrection, etc. That expanded my ability to doctrinally deconstruct the ideas of millenarianism. Additionally, it can be helpful to look at other religions and look at how they envision the millennium happening and then compare notes and see like, oh, they actually believe a lot of the same things, but we don't align in these other ways. Why don't we align like that? And that can help you to start to see the patterns too, like examining the Jehovah's Witnesses belief, which very closely parallel Mormon beliefs, or looking at even something like Buddhist or Hindu beliefs, where they believe in some kind of 1,000-year reign of peace, but Christ isn't involved at all. And so like maybe this is tapping into a deeper human psychological fantasy of like a world of abundance and peace rather than a prediction of the future. Just for fun, in the next video, I will tell you my favorite way of processing millenarianism. Okay, time for my favorite way to deconstruct millenarianism. And I don't have a good name for this, so I've settled on calling it the yes and deconstruction method. Because in improv comedy, in like acting, there's this colloquial rule called the yes and rule, in which if someone else in the improv comedy does something that's unexpected or outlandish or totally crazy, instead of contradicting them or trying to undo the craziness that they've done, you just roll with it and you say like, yes, and then you just make it even more crazy, or you just build on top of it. And that's part of what makes improv comedy so fun, is that you have this cyclical building of in improbable themes coming from the organic chemistry of the actors on stage. So this is my yes and theory for LDS millenarianism. Now, in my LDS life, I didn't have firm beliefs about evolution, the age of the world, etc. It was kind of like if I was in school, the world was super old, millions and billions of years old. And if I was at church, it was more like 6,000 years old. The way I reconciled this at the time was by thinking that maybe it's symbolic, or maybe each one of those days, at the beginning of the world was 1,000,000 years or 1,000 years because Kolob's timing is different. And, all kinds of weird mental gymnastics go into that kind of reasoning. However, when I started going through my faith deconstruction, I started to become a more integrated human being, and I started to recognize that there were definite conflicts between the actual evidence about the age of the world and the story that I was making up in my head. And some of those conflicts came into very stark reality when faced with something like the history of the Native Americans on the American continent, because they've been there 15 to 20,000 years, and not just, 2-ish thousand years, as the Book of Mormon posits. So I started to have to reorient my ideas about the whole history of the world, and kind of consolidate it into one narrative, that it's always been super old. No symbolism, no mental gymnastics required. It's just super old. And I also started doing a lot of reading and deconstruction around patriarchy, including this extremely important and influential book called The Chalice and the Blade by Riane Eisler. And this led me to my deconstruction theory, which is that even though the earth is much, 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 much older than the Mormon doctrine can account for, patriarchy itself is actually about 6,000 years old. And it is an extremely violent structure that only changes with cataclysmic events. And it's connected to the emergence of the Garden of Eden story. So maybe these ancient patriarchs were actually predicting the end of patriarchy. So in a nutshell, my approach, or at least the most successful approach for me in deconstructing millenarianism, has not been to contradict it head on, but to actually lean into those cycles and learn enough to actually use those cycles to turn it back on itself, and to recognize that maybe those prophecies are true. Maybe these are the last days, but maybe they're the last days of patriarchy. Maybe the blessed 1,000-year millennium is a fantasy or an archetype that is common throughout the world to our human consciousness. Or maybe it's an actual sense of what is coming. Maybe it's an interconnected, morphing of space and time, so that we actually do know this is in the future for all of us someday. But maybe it's not what the LDS doctrine says that it will be. I also think that this can be helpful, this kind of lean in, give it a yes and theory, because it makes it more possible to talk to your friends and family who may still be believing members of the church. Because then instead of just shutting them down or feeling like you have to wave away their ideas about it being the last days, etc., you can lean into that too and say yeah, isn't it crazy? I'm so glad that this stuff is happening so that we can see how damaging our systems are right now. As for the second coming of Christ, I think there are a lot of ways to yes and that too, or lean into the cyclical patterns there also. Because when you're reading something like, where did I put it? A New Testament by Haltausig, which compiles a bunch of the ancient Christianity documents that have been discovered in the last century or two, you start to realize that the Christ that emerges from the collective of all of these documents, so the New Testament plus all of the documents that weren't included in the canon of the New Testament, you start to see this image of a really radical, or maybe not radical, maybe that's the wrong word, but more like in tune philosopher in the tradition of Buddha or Lao Tzu or even Plato, who is sensing the patterns of things and trying to teach his followers how to get in tune with the true order of the universe. Thus, in our context for millenarianism, maybe the second coming of Christ isn't actually a personal visitation from a corporeal deity, but rather an emergence of this consciousness again in the world. Maybe it's an emergence of this consciousness on a scale that we have never seen before. Maybe that emergence is what saves our planet from the climate change, and what saves us from these patriarchal institutions which have been hoarding money for the wealthy and depleting feeding the poor for eons. But if this doesn't work for you, then go find your own way to deconstruct millenarianism. I think the important thing is that you work on it, not which method you choose. Good luck! Because I was flipping through a lot of my cult books this morning, I was reminded of this quote from Stephen Hassan in Combating Cult Mind Control, in which he realized for the first time, he connected the dots for the first time, that the Moonies, the cult that he was inducted into, had been brainwashing people in the 1950s, and that his cult had been using the exact same techniques on him. And he says, it became obvious to me that the processes we used in the Moonings were almost identical, and a big question for me began to emerge. Does God have to use the same tactics as Satan in order to make an ideal world? I think this is really relevant to an LDS mindset too, because when we're arguing that Joseph Smith wasn't perfect and that he just kind of accidentally manipulated and spiritually coerced 40 women, and that he didn't actually translate the Book of Abraham and was duplicitous as a treasure digger, is it more likely that God would be behind these techniques, or that Joseph was making it up? There's a quote by Tim Ferriss that says, "Money doesn't change you. It reveals who you really are when you don't have to be nice." And I think that the same could be said of TikTok or many social media platforms. It doesn't change Mormons to go on social media. It reveals what the church has actually taught them about how to see and interact with people. Which is why I kind of appreciate, in some weird, bizarre, paradoxical way, when trolls show up on my feed, because I feel like that is the best illustration of exactly what I am trying to get rid of in my life. That kind of thinking. What's the difference between a troll and just a believing member? Or a troll and just an Exmo member? That's a good question, and I think there is a whole spectrum that we need to acknowledge that goes from the believing Mormon side to the ex and post-Mormon side, and that trolls can come from anywhere in that spectrum. In my experience, trolling doesn't come from what you believe about the cosmic universe or about deity or any of those things, so much as it does about what you believe about other people and about yourself. For that reason, I think that ex-fundamentalist conversational spaces, ex-Mormon spaces, ex-J-Dub spaces, all of those spaces tend to have a lot of trolls, because we were all taught to think in very shallow, two-dimensional ways with a lot of circular logic and a lot of emotional reactivity. If you're worried that you have been drifting into trolling territory, or if you're trying to recognize a troll who's been interacting with you, here are some of the common signs. There tends to be a lot of logical and emotional fallacies, such as circular logic, shifting goalposts, ad hominem attacks, bandwagon fallacies, ad populum fallacies, etc. The trolls usually want to criticize the person, their appearance, their logic, anything, rather than actually address the issues or actually go and look up the issues and do some real research themselves. They tend to be very judgmental and make a lot of assumptions about someone. They tend to be pretty violent and use a lot of violent imagery, tend to treat the conversation as a battle or as a contest or as something that they have to dominate. They tend to be dismissive for those same reasons. If they don't feel like they can dominate the conversation, then they'll just dismiss it and use moral superiority to exit the conversation. And they tend to be really reactive and emotionally based in their reasoning. By way of visual aid, this comment showed up in my feed just a little while ago, and I think it perfectly exhibits the superiority complex that is usually attached to members who have allied themselves with a narcissistic organization. Because the narcissistic organization is terrified of being invalidated, and so usually the members have to adopt that same fear too. Anyway, when I do meet comments like this, I try to remember that this is just another evidence of how this system has victimized other people. Did you have a spiritual deconversion from the LDS Church? Because I think those stories are some of the most interesting about learning about the post-Mormon community. I've heard stories of members who were active, believing till their mid-40s, and then they would say a prayer and say, God, if this isn't true, then please tell me. And their testimony instantly evaporated. There's the Mormon story, I think it's Simon Southerton, who talks about going to bed one night as a believer and then waking up the next morning as a non-believer. There are stories about ancestors coming to guide someone out of the church, God guiding people out of the church, Jesus guiding people out of the church, like Grant Palmer. I think those stories are fascinating. Because of course, one of the big stereotypes about the post-Mormon community is that like, oh, we've lost the light in our eyes, we're not spiritual anymore. When in reality, a significant number of us post-Mormons are leaving the church because of spiritual experiences. So here are my 3 most important spiritual deconversion events from the LDS Church. To preface this is 100% true to my experience, and I still am under construction about like, what happened in these experiences? How do I interpret these now? I don't know. I'm just going to use the LDS terminology that I used at the time to understand these experiences because that's what I have. Experience number 1 was with genealogy. I was doing a lot of family history work and a lot of temple work for these family names. And I started having really spiritual experiences with my ancestors. And at one point I woke up in the morning and I just felt this very urgent, pressing need that I interpreted as being from my ancestors. That I had 5 ancestresses who were afraid of being forgotten. So I started asking the spirit questions like, where are these ancestresses in my family tree? Okay, they're on this side of the family. How many generations back are they? They're this many generations back. And then I went into my family tree and I started reading through the names. And I was like, is this one of the ancestresses? Yes or no? And I would feel like this impression of yes or no. When I had finished writing down names from these 2 generations that I had been prompted to go to, I had 5 names. It was a part of my family tree that I had never researched before because their work had been done for a really long time and I didn't need to do any research there. So they were all new to me, but as I did the research, I found out that they were all 2nd or lower down the list polygamist wives in Utah. And further, the only name that I didn't write down from that bracket of my generations was in a monogamous marriage in Utah. So that led to some interesting research, but fast forward a little bit. Before I had really started the main bulk of the research, I started having dreams, or I might say visions. And these visions were about this enormous wave, and that I was like at this resort in these dreams, and I was talking to family members, and then this enormous wave like starts building in the distance and coming towards us. And as I'm looking at this wave, I'm looking for my car, but like someone has taken my car, and I'm worried about my kids, and I'm worried about my husband, and I'm worried about my family, but I can't find a way out. And so I just watch the wave. And in the dreams, I always woke up before the wave ever hit, before it ever crashed. I just saw this wall of water coming towards me. Well, fast forward 6 months into my faith journey, and I was writing all the time in my journal about how I felt like I was drowning, and I felt like I just kept being hit by wave after wave of deconstruction. And I was like, whoa, I had a vision about this. Then, as I was researching and finding extremely distressing things, I had this bizarre experience where at the same time as I was reading distressing things, I felt this current of deep peace. And I felt the whole time that it was going to be okay and that the church didn't have to be true. I want to tell you a fun story today about Buffalo Bill Cody, who ran a vaudeville entertainment live wildlife show. It was super racist, super sexist, a horrible show, but it was extremely popular at the time, and he eventually performed for the Queen of England. And in this show, he had a character who came onto the scene named Parley P. Pratt, who was a Mormon wife stealer who came and stole the wives of some of his, actor settlers in his performance. First time I encountered this story in grad school, I was kind of offended and thought it was like, oh, well, that's sensationalized and mischaracterized for the Mormons of the time. And then in my faith deconstruction, I learned the actual history of Parley P. Pratt. You probably know some of his history from Sunday school, which is that he was born in New York. He got in with Sidney Rigdon. He convinced Joseph to meet Sidney Rigdon, and then the two of them convinced Joseph to move the church down to Kirtland. He became a key player in a lot of the restoration parts. He wrote a lot of hymns, a lot of poems. He became besties with Brigham Young. He has a canyon named after him, etc., etc. What you might not know is the rest of this history, such as that he went on a series of missions and routinely told or converted women on his missions without telling them about polygamy, and then brought them back to Utah, where they got to discover how many wives he had married and how many kids he had had before ever talking to them. This scenario is related in The 19th Wife by Annalisa Young, so if you want a source, go read that book. Anyway, Parley P. Pratt did this at one time on his mission to San Francisco, where he met a gold digger's family and converted his wife and the oldest children of the family. The gold digger husband was not at all interested in the gospel, and he seems to have been fairly abusive and a bit of a drunkard anyway, so it's not exactly like this was a happy marriage situation, but somehow Parley convinced this wife to come back and be married to him as his 12th wife, and the husband took the kids away and tried to rescue them from the Mormons by leaving them with her parents in Arkansas. Not surprisingly, this poor woman, upon returning to Utah and finding that she was the 12th in a long line of wives and all of a sudden had no family and no children, and Parley P. Pratt didn't exactly support his wives. So she missed her kids and wanted to bring them back, and eventually went down to Arkansas and basically kidnapped her children and tried to steal their clothes back so that she could bring them back and live with them in Utah. When the husband, the abandoned husband, found out about this, he brought Parley before a judge, and when he couldn't prove that Parley had actually done the kidnapping of the children or the clothes, then he was acquitted, and so the husband took justice into his own hands and came after Parley with a gun. Parley didn't die of the gunshots immediately, but he did die a few hours later from blood loss, and apparently his last words were, "I die as a martyr to the faith." Immediately after this murder in May of 1857, Brigham Young began eulogizing Parley and talking about him in sermons as one of the great martyrs of the faith. And 1857 was also the year that Buffalo Bill Cody was passing through Utah. When I announced yesterday that I was going to be signing off from TikTok in about 2 weeks, I got a lot of comments about angst involved in moving from the deconstruction to the reconstruction phase, and forecasts that I wouldn't be able to leave it alone. I'm not trying to prove a forecast correct or incorrect, but I have been through several deconstructions before this faith deconstruction. We have some food allergies between my husband and I, and so we've had to do a massive deconstruction about thinking about our diets, thinking about bodies, thinking about health. We've done a deconstruction over thinking about parenting, thinking about natural births, thinking about a lot of things. So because this isn't my first deconstruction rodeo with a faith deconstruction, it's certainly been the biggest, but it hasn't been my first. I know somewhat of the landscape of what a deconstruction looks like and when it's time to move on to the reconstruction. And for me, the telltale sign that I'm ready to move on to a reconstruction is that I stop being obsessively preoccupied by the thing, and I start, like, this is just particular to me, I start playing a lot of video games. And I think, and also it's really involved video games. Like right now, it's Civ 6. For this deconstruction, it's Civ 6 for me. And I think that that's because video games allow me to kind of smudge the borders of what I'm thinking about so that I can redraw the lines, redraw the parameters of how I am thinking. And so during each of these deconstructions, there's been a phase where, after I've done a lot of the intellectual and emotional and psychological processing, then I get to a point where I start playing video games and I stop, it's almost like my brain is clicking into it's time to stop thinking about this all the time now. And I know at that point that that's when I'm ready to start reconstructing. And that has happened. So I know I'm ready. This isn't to say that it'll happen that exact same way for you, because I can only speak for my own deconstruction patterns. But I just want to put it out there that there are patterns to deconstruction. And it might help to think about previous times in your life, because I'm guessing that even if your faith deconstruction is also the biggest deconstruction you've ever gone through, that it's probably not the only one. That there have probably been times when you went through a Marie Kondo phase, or you oriented yourself or remade yourself when you went to college or something like that, where you had a deconstruction period of some aspect of your thinking or of your behaviors or of your life, and that observing how you reacted to that deconstruction period can inform you about how to recognize the signs that you're ready to move on for this deconstruction too. But again, I think the most important thing to remember is that nobody else has a template for your journey. You have your journey. Okay, here are some quick and dirty tips on how to allow your deconstruction phase to find its natural resolution, whenever that is for you, so that you can move on to the reconstruction phase, the more joyful part of this process of remaking yourself and reimagining the life that you want to live. First, take your time. Grieve everything that you need to grieve. There are tons of little things that are not going to be listed in, books about deconstruction that are just particular to your life. Little traditions that your family had that were connected to the LDS Church, or things that you feel reactive to that you can't do anymore, even if they're not necessarily directly tied to the LDS Church, because in your mind that was that was an outgrowth of your obedience or of your devotion to the church, and you need to grieve all of it. Be angry about anything that you need to be angry about. I like to remember what Brene Brown says, which is that we need to be hard on systems but soft on people. So remember that the people in your life are also victims of this system, and that even the real jerks are also victims. It doesn't mean you have to accept them being a-holes to you, but try to make room for them to be victims too, and channel your emotions towards actually causing a change instead of just reacting to the jerks or to the insensitive things that people say. In Untamed, Glennon Doyle talks a lot about your inner knowing or your inner voice, and so do a lot of other deconstruction role models out there. I think this is great advice, but it can be kind of triggering for a member of the church because it sounds so much like the ways that we've been indoctrinated to listen to the Spirit. So if that doesn't work for you, then I'd say approach it like this, like just get curious about things. Let yourself notice things in a new way. Let yourself be curious about things in a new way, and go easy with yourself. Like take yourself back through, kind of elementary school. Like pretend you're giving your inner child a tour of the world and see what fascinates you, and go with that. Follow those curiosity threads. Let yourself be human about this. Let yourself have made mistakes. Let yourself be stupid. It's actually fine. Feeling stupid is part of the human experience. Making mistakes is part of the human experience. And so is learning from those things. So if you feel like you were stupid and you just can't forgive yourself for believing in the Mormon church, relax. There are lots of people who've believed in wackier things than the Mormon church. And it also gave you this opportunity to, learn this weird, wacky bit of history about the American journey. In that same vein of forgiving yourself for your mistakes, also allow yourself to change after your deconstruction. Let yourself change your mind. Let yourself change your preferences. Give yourself permission to change. And when you do feel like you're ready, make sure you're taking actions out of love and not fear. Okay, and these are my 3 most powerful tools for moving from deconstruction to reconstruction. First and simplest is allow yourself to laugh about this. Not laugh in a cynical way, not laugh at your believing family or friends when they say outrageous things on Facebook, not laugh at the church in a way that you're making fun of them. I mean, just laugh that this even happened. How did this religion even happen? How crazy that we were all so caught up in this, that we all left on these 1 to 2 year missions where we committed not to talking to our family so that we could tell people a totally made up story about some guy in the woods in New York. How zany is that? And then indulge in all of the ways that this is humorous. Watch South Park, watch the Book of Mormon musical. Just let yourself have fun with this, because this is part of your experience. This is part of your heritage. You spent a good number of years of your life on this. You deserve to have fun with it. And if you've gone through that phase and you're done with that, then I really think that this is the key to fully investing in the reconstruction phase, and that is getting connected with your creativity. There are a lot of books or programs or other things about this, but the one that I've loved the most is called The Artist's Way, and I think it really applies to everyone, even though it's specifically targeted towards artists. I think it applies to everyone because it's mostly about reconnecting to your creative center. And regardless of what you really do, I think if what you're doing has a spark for you, that means your creativity is engaged when you do that thing. It doesn't have to be a fine art to engage your creativity. Every single profession has creatives in it. And this particular program is a 12-week program that helps you to just write out your emotions, process your feelings of grief, anger, sadness, regret, etc. about certain experiences, and connect to that creative center so that you can move forward and make the life that you really want. And last but not least, I think that the most beautiful expression of reconstruction is when someone can start to really see the people around them, really have compassion for them, see them through any labels that you gave them as a church member, or through any labels that you gave them as a struggling, questioning, or ex-Mormon. Our relationships are what make our life rich, and they're what help us to learn. And even though a lot of things in the church are wrong right now, I think one of the things that keeps a lot of people in is that they have relationships there. And when you start seeing other people as full and complex humans, you make room for yourself to be that way too. One final thought today about the value of deconstruction, the value of integrating yourself, and Joseph Smith. There was a moment in my faith deconstruction where I had this epiphany that Joseph's main weakness was that he could not integrate himself. He would project his weaknesses, his failings, his flaws onto others, and he would absorb their strengths back to himself. I think one of the places where this happens really clearly is in the Book of Mormon and in his interactions in general with Native American cultures. You can look into John Larson's comparisons of Joseph Smith with the Iroquois for more information on this, but I think that the main takeaway is that Joseph Smith was kind of like a real-life Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in our history. And that what has made his legacy so damaging is that he wasn't willing to accept the possibility that he was Mr. Hyde. Ultimately, now I take Joseph Smith's story as a cautionary tale, and that one of the surest ways of doing harm is to think that we're incapable of doing harm. So I've been planning to do a video about truth, and then today I found out that the MGM lion was voiced by a tiger, that the bald eagles in movies were voiced by red-tailed hawks, and that Mufasa was voiced by the combination sound of a tiger, a grizzly bear, and a fighter jet plane. And that Flipper was actually, and SpongeBob's dolphins were voiced by kookaburras. And I'm like, is anything in my life real? But anyway, what I actually wanted to talk about was the pursuit of truth. There is something really deep in the human psyche that craves truth, that craves reality, that craves authenticity. And I think that Mormonism really capitalizes on that desire from the human soul for truth, because a lot of the most inspiring quotes from general authorities or from scriptures or other things are about the pursuit of truth, about the recognition of truth, and about the consolidation or the gathering of truth. One of the most potent, and I think still one of the most beautiful ideas to me that I've taken from Mormonism is this idea that all truth is circumscribed into one great whole. Or I think it was Henry J. Eyring's father used to say that nothing is true is excluded from Mormonism. I don't actually agree with his quote, but I do love that idea. I think that is a really romantic idea, that like whatever is true, wherever it comes from, if it's true, it should be part of our paradigm. And I think that idea has been a really powerful engine for my faith crisis, because I wasn't in the church because it was useful. I wasn't in the church even because it was good. I don't actually think it is good anymore, but I thought that for a long time, but that was just a bonus. I was in the church because I thought it was true. And as I leave the church, as I've deconstructed the church, the main motivator for that has been wanting the truth. I want to be integrated. I want to be with organizations of integrity. I want to be with people of integrity. And the church isn't it. I think it's possible that it was more of an organization or a place of integrity in the middle of the 20th century when the truths weren't so widely known, or even maybe at the end of the 19th century. Even with all of the abuses that were going on at that time, you know, people were actually trying to live what they actually thought was true, and I can admire that. At some point, though, you have to reconcile the facts, and the facts that this abusive system hasn't actually led you to the truth. And something that I think is kind of sad about the ex-Mormon community is that a lot of people are so exhausted by the manipulations of truth in the church that they just give up on integrity as they leave. And if any of you are going through that jadedness right now, I just want to say, keep being honest, keep requiring that. That's what makes the world better. To continue our conversation about truth, like after you've gone through a faith crisis, how do you keep up the hope that there is anything true? How do we maintain the stamina to live with integrity after we've discovered how manipulative and how exploitative the church has been with our desire to be honest. This is a really hard question, and it's a really important question. And if you feel like you've figured it out, please leave your ideas in the comments, because I think this is something that we're all working on and that we can really help each other with by sharing ideas. For me, in my experience, I rested a lot on Brene Brown's words and Brene Brown's studies about vulnerability and about authenticity. And I love her quote that says, vulnerability is our path back to each other. And I really think that Mormonism, in kind of this paradoxical way, has functioned like a lot of the last days prophecies about false Christs and about organizations, the great organizations that like suck the souls out of the people in the last days. And I feel like that's what Mormonism has done to a lot of its post members. It's made them actually like allergic to the ideas of truth and integrity, because post members tend to get really wary when someone starts talking like that, because it's so triggering after their experiences with the church. If that's the case for you, I'm so sorry, and I hope that you can find other words to talk about these ideas. Maybe vulnerability is a good word, or authenticity, or something else. But I think the idea or the concept of being true to ourselves and accurately representing our experiences and accurately stating where we are so that other people can find us, and then reaching out to other people with love and compassion based on their honest experiences, and believing each other when we share our experiences is critical to healing our communities and healing our world. And this might sound like kind of an abstract issue, but I think this is really at the core of what is haunting us beneath the layers of all kinds of dysfunction today, between the political divides, in the climate change crisis, in racism, in sexism. All of these things are fueled by this fundamental disconnect that we don't know how to be honest with ourselves. And, we've gotten so tied up in legalese about whether a corporation is actually innocent or responsible for something, or whether they can be legally excused from it, that we've missed the point, which is that these big corporations are doing a ton of damage. They're sucking away resources from the people who really need it, and the people who do need help are not getting it. So wherever you are on this journey, be honest. Please be honest. Please keep asking others to be honest too. One last add-in to our conversation about truth. This quote is from Lula Rich, the documentary on Amazon Prime, and I wanted to know what you think of it. Like, do you think it's true? Do you think it's false? Do you think it's partially accurate? Whatever. It's from one of the experts in the doc. He says, when you're inside a lie that has told you that you're in the right place at the right time and that the people around you have the right answer and everybody else out there is wrong, you belong in this community of winners, enlightened people. This is what a cult does. If everything is possible, nothing is true. And what do you think of that? Like, what is the connection between talking about truth and a lot of these cult mind control organizations? Because a lot of them do use truth as a lever towards requiring people's allegiance. And is that accurate? If everything is possible, then nothing is true? I just keep chewing on that. Like, what do you think? Yesterday we talked about truth, which I think is the great human yearning at the center of our souls. This hope that there is a grand thing that we could all arrive at, a grand meaning that applies to all of us. And today I want to talk about the opposite of that, which is the void. I think that the other way to think about the void is the great fear at the core of all of us that nothing has meaning. In kind of the same way that the Mormon Church has capitalized on truth and set itself up as like the distributor of all truth, it has also set itself up as the great defense against nothingness, against meaninglessness. And in the church membership, generally, there is this attitude of like superiority or condescension towards those who are not members of the church, because we say things like, oh, it's just too bad for them. They like don't understand that families could be together forever. Oh, it's too bad for them. They don't understand that life goes on after death. Oh, it's too bad for them. They don't understand. And what members, like most of us, were asserting when we said those types of things was that our meaning-making paradigm of the LDS Church was the truth, was the way to interpret events, and that if people weren't using that paradigm to interpret their events, or were feeling depressed or discouraged or lonely, then they were either ignorant or stubborn and rebellious because they've left the church, or just wanting to wallow in nothingness. This is super relevant in the post-Mormon context because when you go through a faith deconstruction, all of a sudden you have to face the reality that this paradigm that you've been using and striving for to attain all truth, to circumscribe all of reality into one great whole, might not be true, might not be accurate, might not be a complete picture of how things work. And then you have to face the great human fear of the void. We'll get into how to deal with this in the next video, but basically, if you don't know what the void is, it's like this existential nothingness. It's like gazing beyond death, beyond the present moment, and feeling the overwhelming weight of the possibility that you have no idea what's coming, and you have no way to control it, and that there might be nothing ahead of you. There might not be life after death. You might never see your loved ones again. There might be no point. The really tough thing about the void as a post-Mormon is, first, I think, that you have to face it because you are deconstructing the framework that has protected you from shielding it. You're taking down the blinders. When you go through a faith deconstruction with the LDS Church, you're taking down the visor that you've put up, that you've had up, that everyone else has been reinforcing for your entire life, that has made you think there is no void. And so you have to face that. You have to face the possibility that there is the void, that there is nothingness, that there is no meaning. And then the second most difficult thing is that there is no guarantee that anything can fill that. A lot of people lose their faith in God completely, and God is typically what's used to fill the void for a lot of religiously minded people. And for a lot of post-Mormons, that's not enough anymore. Like just saying, oh, God exists, isn't enough anymore because we've been hearing that from general authorities who have been lying to us for our whole lives. So that's not enough to fill the void anymore. We want something more concrete, but if there is something more concrete, please tell me because I haven't found it. But this is a place where I think it's appropriate to start to rediscover faith. In the LDS context, faith usually meant show confidence in things even if they don't make sense, or even if there is evidence contrary to that thing, you just believe it anyway. You just behave as if it's true. Most typically, this is applied to people like Joseph Smith, people like the modern church leaders, and they're like, well, even if they make mistakes, just have faith, just choose to believe, blah, blah, blah. I think this is a totally ridiculous definition for faith because, in my opinion, faith is what bridges the gap between what we know and what we hope for or what we don't know. It's kind of like the portion of the graph that forecasts what we think the future will be based on the evidence that we have. It doesn't mean going backwards in the evidence and trying to disbelieve evidence, but that's like the way the church does it, so whatever. The definition of faith that I like to use now is that faith is a belief in the unseen order of things, and a belief that because we are here, because we are conscious, because we're able to ask questions like, what is the meaning of life? And does my life have purpose? And should I love my neighbor? And things like that. And our intrinsic sense of conscience tells us that there is something more, even if we can't prove it. And we'll keep going in the next part. One of the most famous philosophers to deal with the void or the abyss was Friedrich Nietzsche, and one of his main goals with his philosophy was to force people to face what he considered the reality of nothingness or the reality of meaninglessness. And I think this quote is especially relevant to the post-Mormon context. He says, "He who fights with monsters might take care lest he thereby become a monster. And if you gaze for long into an abyss, the abyss gazes also into you." All right, with this quote, I want to layer in an analogy as part of how I process the void. So stick with me. If you've ever been to the ocean at night, it can be a really creepy experience because you're going to the shore faced with this huge darkness, huge blackness. You know, there's no light coming from the water itself unless there's like a full moon or something reflecting off the water. Otherwise, you're just staring at this big, oppressive, and kind of loud darkness as the waves are coming in towards you. You can hear these sounds, but you can't see the waves individually. So you're just hearing the sounds and you can't see what's ahead of you. And if you imagine being someone who has never seen the ocean, has never known the ocean. Imagine coming to the ocean at night. And how terrifying that would be. Like, what are you encountering here? This big darkness that's making these noises. What is happening? And compare this with coming to the ocean during the day. Because during the day, the ocean is still huge. It's still like incomprehensibly enormous. And there is still so much going on that we don't even understand to this day going on in the ocean. But it looks relatively simple. And it's kind of awe-inspiring how big it is. But you can see it, and so it's less immediately threatening than if you were to approach it at night, because you can see the waves, you know where the sound is coming from, you can actually see the horizon in the distance, and so it doesn't seem as unmanageable and as fear-inducing as it does if you are coming to it at night. When I think of this quote from Friedrich Nietzsche, and I think of these experiences like standing at the shore of the ocean, this is kind of like what I imagine we are doing existentially as we come to the borders of what we know about life. We just really can't see into the future. We can't see beyond death. We don't have guarantees about what's out there. We don't understand to this day what's going on after death. It is totally possible, and there is a lot of evidence to support the theory that there is just nothingness, there's just darkness, that there's this big oppressive meaninglessness after we die. There's also evidence to suggest that we do see loved ones after we die, that there is something out there, that there is a soul that exists without a body. I kind of like to think of the void as this dark ocean, and that the reality of the ocean at night doesn't have to preclude the reality of the ocean during the day. Continuing on with our discussion about the void and how to process it as a post-Mormon, I think one of the best practices you can do is just to make space for both possibilities, or rather all possibilities. Maybe reincarnation is real. Maybe resurrection is real. Maybe nothingness is real. Maybe there's some combination of those things that we have no idea how it all works. Like, maybe we're looking at the ocean, but we don't have any tools to actually observe the ocean. You know, we're just looking at the top of the ocean. If you're looking at the ocean at night, it looks like the abyss. It looks like nothingness. It looks like meaninglessness. It looks like fear. If you're looking at the ocean during the daytime, it looks huge and incomprehensible and awe-inspiring, but also incomprehensible. Like you don't know what's happening beyond the horizon. You don't know what's happening beneath the surface. And essentially, I think it does us all a bit of good to treat these things with some respect. Like, respect the mystery that is after death. Let's conjecture, let's speculate, let's draw conclusions based on the evidence that we have. Like, we have a conscience and we have consciousness. What does that indicate about the soul? What do near-death experiences show us about the body, or about the afterlife, or about the universe? What do all of these things say? Let's keep putting the pieces together, keep making theories, keep making assertions, but let's not nail anything down. There's a lot that we can learn from allowing for mystery, for allowing for many possibilities where we don't know the conclusion. And there's a lot of value in recognizing that if you stood at the edge of the abyss and looked over the edge into the void, you understand why so many humans have clung to religion. And you can understand why so many of your believing family members and friends are terrified to take down the blinders around Mormonism, why they're so afraid to take down the visors and admit that maybe they won't see their family after they die. Maybe there is no such thing as an eternal family. Maybe we just get reincarnated and it's a shuffle every time. Like, we don't know. Once you take those visors down, those visors of certainty that the Mormon Church has given you, even though they might be false, they're still comforting to a lot of people. And once you've stood at the edge of the abyss, you can understand that. And you can also understand why so many philosophers and religious leaders and others have projected good conclusions about the future after death, because we do have some indications that there is something good beyond. We also have indications that there's something bad, but maybe there's room for all of these theories. If you've been in a faith crisis for any amount of time, then you probably are familiar with those moments where things just seem overwhelming and it seems hopeless, and the waves of grief and anger and resentment and betrayal just never seem to stop. Like you seem to keep finding out new ways that the church lied to you, betrayed you, let you down. That was kind of on my mind in the last couple of weeks because of the Boy Scout stuff. Because I was like, does it ever end? Like, does the mistreatment of other people ever end with the church? And I just can't believe that I spent so much of my life thinking that they were admirable. Maybe that's why this story was on my mind lately. This is a story that my husband read in a book a couple of years ago, and I looked it up again so I could share it with you. This is the story of Admiral Jim Stockdale, who survived 8 years in a Vietnamese concentration camp as the highest ranking officer that was captured by the military during the Vietnam War. It was a horrible concentration camp. They didn't have any prisoner rights. They were tortured repeatedly. There was no set release date. They had no idea how or if they would survive. This man, Jim Stockdale, did survive, and he managed to tell his tale in books and interviews. And he's kind of famous for saying that the first people to die in this concentration camp were the optimists, because they would say, oh, we're going to be out by Christmas. And then Christmas would come and Christmas would go. Then they'd say, oh, we're going to be out by Easter, and Easter would come and Easter would go. And then Thanksgiving, and then it would be Christmas again. And then they would die of a broken heart. When asked how he survived this horrible, torturous situation, he said, I never lost faith in the end of the story. I never doubted not only that I would get out, but also that I would prevail in the end and turn the experience into the defining event of my life, which in retrospect, I would not trade. And later in his interview, he says, this is a very important lesson. You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you cannot afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they may be. There are all kinds of ups and downs in our faith crises, and I think that this lesson is really important for these kinds of transitions too. You don't need to know how you're going to make it out. You just need to hold on to the confidence that you will. You're going to figure it out. You're going to make it through this. You're going to crest the waves. Some of them are going to knock you over. Sometimes you're going to feel like you're drowning. Sometimes you're going to feel like you're surfing. But you're going to make it. You're going to make it to the shore. We hinted at this in our discussions about truth and the void, but I think this particular topic needs more attention. The fact that we as humans, that our brains as human brains are incredible meaning makers. Humans as a species are kind of unique in this way, that we have much larger brains, that our brains grow much more after birth than most other animals do. And a lot of the capabilities of our brains are designed around making connections between different things and allowing us to be adaptable and to learn new things and to connect new ideas and to apply different disciplines to each other. This also allows for the process of what most psychologists or storytellers or others call meaning making, which is where we connect things from different disciplines and we string it into this larger metaphorical fabric of purpose or of meaning. This is a huge part of our daily functioning in our brains because it makes us feel like we have something that we're doing that's worthwhile. It tells us our own story, so we have a sense of identity, and it gives us a projection for the future, for expectations or for things that we are looking for. It gives us hope. It gives us faith. It gives us all kinds of different benefits psychologically. The LDS Church as a construct really stimulates this part of our being, this part of our brains, because the LDS construct comes into someone's life and says everything has meaning. And in fact, this was one of Joseph Smith's big character traits, is that he saw himself as kind of the template for God. And that everything that he responded to or that he resonated with or that he wanted or that he liked, he would attribute that as something coming from God. And so he would kind of make everything transcendent. He would make everything sacred. I think that in the Brigham Young biography, John Turner calls this the sacralizing the ordinary, as in making sacred even ordinary things. One of the prime tools of LDS theology in this meaning-making process is what we call the Spirit, because when a person has two disparate events in their lives, let's say a family is like out of money and then the breadwinner in the family doesn't get the job that they apply for, and it's like, this doesn't make sense, you're doing everything right, why didn't God help them get this job? And the Spirit is the bridge between these disparate events, because with the Spirit theology, that family can say, oh, I wasn't supposed to get that job, that was the wrong place for me, or God just wanted me to get more involved in my ward, etc. So the Spirit becomes this great meaning. In the LDS context, this meaning-making process using the Spirit is highly rewarded. That you can get up in testimony meeting and bear your testimony about how you missed that plane flight because there was probably like an abusive person who was going to sit next to you on the plane, and God spared you from that trauma by making you miss your plane flight. Or that you didn't get this job, like the example in the last video, because that company was going to crash, or because there was a better job for you, or because your family needed you at home right now, and so God was like helping you to reprioritize, whatever it is. That kind of meaning-making process is very highly valued and rewarded within the LDS context. You get a lot of attention, you get a lot of praise, a lot of other people say like, oh, you helped me find meaning by sharing that meaning-making story. And so we get in this loop of like everything has to be contextualized through the Spirit. This can be a kind of confusing part of life to navigate as a post-Mormon, because all of a sudden you are separating yourself from the LDS context. You're not using the Spirit to justify or to bridge these disparate events anymore, but you still have, like, it leaves this cavity in your psyche where you have been used to making meaning out of all of these things, and now all of a sudden you're not. And so it's kind of like where you like keep reaching for something, but it's not there. I want to give you a hometown example of this that actually has nothing to do with theology, so it's very non-threatening for any Mormons or ex-Mormons out here. I listened to Hamilton for the first time in the last couple of days, and I've just been listening to it nonstop. It's so interesting. I feel like Lin-Manuel Miranda is like this modern Shakespeare, and so I've been thinking about the Revolution, thinking about Alexander Hamilton, thinking about all of these complex characters that are interacting in this play. And then I got onto TikTok this morning, and look at how many followers I have. What? I don't like check my followers that often, but today I looked at the followers and there are 1776 followers, which is the year of the Revolution, right? Oh my goodness. If this were to happen in an LDS context, I would instantly start meaning making about this. Like, oh, it's meant to be. Like, I was supposed to listen to Hamilton at this time. Like, there's something I need to learn from the Revolution. Maybe I need to go study about it more. Maybe this connects to something else in my life, etc. This isn't to say that there isn't anything in the revolution that I could learn from right now. Maybe that is the case. But I want to highlight the fact that, like, sometimes things are just coincidences. And as you're going through a faith crisis, you have to get used to allowing things to have open-ended meanings. The other key thing about meaning making is that when we're separating from the LDS context, I think there's this differentiation process where we start to reject or try to distance ourselves from a lot of the things that we did while we were active LDS members. In many ways, this can be pretty harmless, stuff like drinking coffee, wearing a tank top, wearing short shorts, going to Costco on Sunday, stuff like that. Those are all ways that people use to differentiate themselves from their past selves as members of the church, or even as nuanced members. Nuanced members might just try to differentiate themselves from the full throttle members by wearing bikinis or doing things like that. Something I see, though, that can really damage your psychological health after you're separating from Mormonism is to, face the void, like we talked about in the previous videos, and be trying to differentiate yourself from the LDS church by shutting down all of your meaning-making processes at once. And that causes a huge withdrawal in your system. Meaning-making for humans, I don't think is optional. I know that there are people who think that they have found a way to live without meaning, such as Friedrich Nietzsche, there are some atheists out there who really advocate for the void, but in some way, I think they have made meaninglessness their meaning. I really don't think you can go completely without meaning. So for a post-LDS or post-Mormon person to be separating from the church and saying I don't want to make meaning at all anymore is kind of like saying oh, well, I used to eat in that organization and I don't believe in it anymore, so now I don't eat. This is a foundational level need for your mind, for your psyche, for the health of your life. What you need in a post-Mormon context is some regulation on your meaning making. You need some temperance in your meaning making because the LDS context is just unbounded. Everything is transcendent. Everything has eternal meaning. There are no coincidences. I saw 1776 this morning after I listened to Hamilton for the first time for a reason. And all that level of meaning making can be kind of oppressive, because it's hard to keep up all of those meanings that you've made. If you missed that job and then you make this justification about why you didn't get it because it was going to fail as a company, and then it succeeds wildly and it has exactly the kind of company culture that you want, then you're stuck because you're well, what was that meaning that I made? I thought that was from the Spirit, etc. What we need to do as post-Mormons is get a healthier set of tools for meaning making. Okay, so what do we do? Because if we have this meaning-making muscle in our brains, but we're differentiating from the LDS Church, and so we're not drawing out meanings on a cosmic scale anymore, how do we make meaning with our lives in healthy ways? I'm going to share with you some of the ideas that I have about meaning making now, but also encourage you not to take these as doctrine, because you're not tied down by doctrine anymore. So if these ideas don't work for you, then go read some philosophers and find a different system that works for you. But here is my process. First, I think it's important to have some foundational values that moderate your meaning making. And one of my foundational values in meaning making is to prioritize people and prioritize relationships. One of the cautionary tales that I take from Joseph Smith is that he prioritized himself in the meaning-making process. And if it felt meaningful to him, then he would do it. He was not good at listening to the concerns of the men and women around him when they expressed things contrary to what he wanted. And so when I go to the meaning-making process, I try to learn from that and say that what other people are thinking and feeling really matters, and how I'm relating to them really matters. And I want to create a space where those relationships can flourish and where we can all build together rather than prioritizing my meaning-making process over everyone else's. I think a conversation about values is probably a separate video, but get all of your core values into this process. They should all be there regulating and moderating your meaning making, because if a proposed meaning making route leads you towards dishonesty, but one of your core values is integrity, then that's not a good route to take. That's not a good way to make meaning out of your life. See where I'm going with this? Second technique is to keep things fluid. I've been reading this amazing book by Adam Grant called Think Again. I haven't gotten all the way through it, but he has this idea at the beginning of the book that I just love, which is where he's recounting an interview with an older man, and the older man has learned to enjoy being wrong, because he's learned that being wrong means he's about to expand his mind. He's about to learn something new. And as part of this interview that he's recounting, he says that the man had learned not to tie his identity to any of his beliefs. And that concept just hit me like a ton of bricks, because from a very early age in the church, we are taught to tie our identities to our beliefs. That, you're not a human first, you're a Mormon. That everything else comes after being a Mormon. So remember to relax. Your beliefs don't have to determine your identity. All right, more tools for healthy meaning making. I think one of the essential aspects of healthy meaning making is not invalidating other people's meaning making, including your LDS friends and family. And I think this does get a lot easier once you recognize the necessity of meaning making for your brain, that you can see your LDS family and friends where they are, that they have been given this huge construct of meaning making and grown either dependent on it, or they really actively enjoy meaning making with this construct. And so you don't need to invalidate their meaning making. This is part of, this would be like someone liking corn dogs and you saying like those aren't good for you, which is perfectly valid, perfectly true. But they still like corn dogs. So at some point, just let them have their corn dogs. It's much healthier to allow them to have their meaning making and then put your own meaning making alongside that, and volunteer your ways of making meaning out of those situations alongside theirs. Not to replace theirs, not to invalidate theirs, not to say that theirs is wrong, but to just say that there are multiple ways to interpret these situations instead of just the one true way that the LDS Church offers. Technique number 4 in healthy meaning making is to be cautious of taking extreme steps around your meaning making process. This becomes really relevant and clear when you look at things like LDS splinter groups or like the FLDS or things like that, where the meaning making cycle of the LDS context has kind of gone on steroids, and people start moving, they sell all their stuff and buy a bunker, they're sleeping on their food storage, they start practicing polygamy. It is just, it's a mess. And anytime you are faced with making a huge decision like that, especially if your leader is using Abraham and Isaac to motivate that decision and to stimulate your meaning making process, that's a huge red flag. But anyway, anytime your meaning making process is suggesting a huge decision like moving across the country or even across the state, selling all your possessions, making radical changes in your family living arrangements, be very wary of that. Find real reasons, if you're going to go through a change like that, find real reasons to go through that, and don't rely on your meaning making cycles to do that, because the meaning making cycles in your brain can be manipulated, sometimes without you even knowing. Lastly and finally, just have fun with it. This is a pleasurable activity for your brain, and it can lead you into really unexpected and new ways of looking at the world. So if you're not making a huge decision like moving to Manti and practicing polygamy, then just have fun with it. Let your brain make meaning. As a last note on the meaning making process, I want to also put out the idea that all of those things that you used to think of as the spirit weren't necessarily wrong either. Maybe there really was some cosmic force out there preventing you from getting that job. Maybe there really was something that was saying, don't get on that plane, and you missed your flight. Who knows? There are a lot of mysteries in the world. But this bridge of the spirit and this urge to try and explain the why of everything in the LDS context, I think can be really damaging, because it causes these loops when our logic about something, or when our explanation about something that we felt was spiritually ratified, doesn't end up being the case. In the post-Mormon context, using the Spirit to bridge very disparate events, or to excuse very bad behavior, or to justify why something undesirable has happened, that can be very triggering, and we tend to react pretty radically to the presentation of that particular meaning-making cycle. But I think it's also fair to say that we don't know everything about the universe, right? Like, there is a lot of mystery out there. There are a lot of unseen things happening around us. Even things that we know are happening around us, like radio waves. You know, we all know that radio waves are saturating our environment, that there are other frequency waves saturating our environment, and we just can't see them. How many things like that are there that we don't even know how to measure, that we don't have instruments to measure? Let's make room for those things too. We don't have to call it the Spirit anymore. We don't have to justify bad behavior. We don't have to bridge disparate events and make hard conclusions as to why that cosmically had to happen, or why you cosmically had to not get that job or miss that plane or whatever. But we can do that while also making room for the fact that there are many different people in many different contexts who describe this very similar intuitive knowing about things. You know, Glennon Doyle calls it a liquid gold, I think was her word for her inner knowing, that she just knew that she was supposed to do these things, and she felt like this liquid gold inside her. For me, in my journals, when I felt the spirit really strongly, it felt like melted butter. And someone else that I knew described this as carbonated honey. And like, think of the similarities between all of these descriptions. And we all came from very different contexts. And I think there's room to say that even if the Spirit isn't a good bridge for all of the things that LDS theology uses it for, there still could very well be big forces that are unseen, that are connecting all of us and guiding us in unknown ways. Today is September 30th, which is Orange Shirt Day, a day that has been chosen by First Nations representatives to remember the tragedies of the children who were killed or who died of neglect in residential schools, specifically in Canada, but also all across the United States, including those run by the LDS Church, in which they took Lamanite children away from their homes, forced them to get baptized, gave them English names, forbade them from practicing their own religious rites, forbade them from speaking their native language, forbade them from participating in their ancestral rituals, and did it all in the name of education. But kind of worse than just education, because it was this attempt to eradicate the the wicked Lamaniteness of these Native American children by culturally homogenizing them with their LDS or other white families. I've mentioned this podcast before, but really go listen to Mormon Stories. I think it's episode 1457. I didn't look it up again this morning, but I've mentioned it a couple times on here, and it is just so important to understanding the perspective of the Native Americans who have been involved with the church, because, you know, alongside all of this, like, eradication of culture that's been happening through things like the residential schools, and then more softly through wards and branches, there's also been this effort to commodify, to fetishize Native American culture at places like BYU by creating things like living legends and using Native American culture, copywriting Native American dances in order to sell the church. If you've been here for any amount of time, you know this is one of my sticking points. I'm absolutely horrified that the church that I thought was so admirable, the church that I grew up loving, the church that I found so much so much happiness in, so much comfort and belonging in, that my tribe, as it were, has been religiously colonizing these native peoples for 200 years, has been appropriating their cultural practices, their words, their whole identity is being appropriated by the church. And I just think it's horrible. A lot of us feel guilty for the things that we did as we were Mormon, and I don't blame you. I feel it too, especially about my mission, because I think, oh my goodness, I went out there and I help other people to get sucked into this mind control. Processing that guilt is a really important part of your faith deconstruction, and it's a really important part of recovering and moving on to your reconstruction phase. You've got to let go of that guilt. But how? The church has done damage in so many ways, and in so many ways, even those of us who had good intentions or who really believed it, we contributed to that damage. We contributed to the sexism. We contributed to the ostracization of ex-members or inactive members. We contributed to the oversimplification of racial stereotypes. We contributed to all kinds of really damaging things. We protected abusers. We promoted a system that was going to introduce cult mind control to others, and that's hard. As always, when you're deconstructing something or when you're processing something, you have to define what it is that you're talking about. So doing free writes or doing pages about, just writing out, what do you feel guilty about? What specifically do you feel guilty about? It could be as specific as one single instance in which you were passing someone in the hallway and you didn't say hi because they had been an inactive member, or because they smelled like tobacco, or because you knew that they had just gotten a divorce or whatever. Or it could be as general as saying that, you served 2 years or 1.5 years in this place where people didn't really need you, but you were there anyway, harassing them every day. So it could be whatever it is, you just got to define it. Once you've defined it, then you can look at the actual ramifications of what you've done and look behind those actions to what happened to you there too, and recognize that you weren't just perpetuating the damage, you were also receiving the damage too. So you are also on this victim list. Then at that point, you can be in more of a position to see all of these damages equally and to let it go. To say, you did what you thought was right. And even if there were damages done, even if someone did get sucked into the cult mind control, you did what you thought was right. You were building your own sense of integrity. You were being committed to your deepest values in the best way that you know how. And you can respect that about yourself. You can respect that about your involvement with the church. Those are still good things. Living by your values and having practiced living by your values, even if you have done some damage, is still a good thing. It's still a good thing that you know how to live by those values. Now it's time to dig deeper and say, now you're going to really live by those values, even though you don't have a template for how to act. Continued in part 2. The other key thing that we have to deconstruct when we're letting go of guilt about our Mormon lives is this idea that we are responsible for other people's choices or other people's learning or other people's spiritual journeys. If you were a missionary, or even if you weren't, you probably had this idea hammered into your head a lot that your righteousness or that our righteousness directly impacted somebody else's ability to receive the gospel. And that puts a lot of responsibility on us as individuals to make sure that other people choose things that affirm us. For missionaries, this means making sure that your converts get baptized, and you just say whatever you have to make the gospel appealing or relevant to them so that they get baptized. For Mormon or member parents, this means doing everything possible to make sure that your children stay on the straight and narrow path, and make sure that they make choices that align with the church so that you are affirmed as a parent also. This is one of the most classic and effective techniques of cult mind control, is to wrap someone's identity around being loyal to the organization. And the church has done that very effectively. So when we are processing our Mormon lives and letting go of that Mormon guilt, part of that is disentangling our identity from other people's choices. You've got to let other people be responsible for their own lives, for their own choices, for their own learning. It's their space. Now, does that mean you back out silently and never say anything against the church so as not to interfere with anyone else's lives? I don't think so, but I think it means that you trust people enough to let them make decisions on their own, to trust them enough to like be able to reason through or feel through their own life experiences, their own logic, and come to their own conclusion. There are a lot of good things that come from growing up in the church, and I think one of them is this commitment to living our values. And that has really stayed with me through my faith deconstruction and now kind of on more of the post-Mormon side, that I'm really committed to living my values, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it's unpopular, even if it's hard. And that is not something we have to let go of as we're deconstructing the church. The problem wasn't the values. The problem was that the church told us to live by our values, but it didn't live by its own values. But the problem wasn't the values, the problem was the church. And as Maya Angelou says, when you know better, you do better. So now that we know better, we'll do better. When Kate Kelly was at large, on the Mormon scene with ordained women, I really didn't approve of her, and it didn't faze me at all when she got excommunicated. I didn't know anything about her. I hadn't listened to her, and it took a long time before I was willing to hear her out, to hear her point of view, to read or listen to anything that she had said, and to truly admire and respect all of the work that she did to try and humanize and make the church structure more egalitarian while she was in it. At this point, even though I still admire people like Jennifer Finlayson Fife and Julia de Azevedo Hanks, who are trying to carve out a space for Mormon feminism and create healthy patterns in the church, it seems kind of like a losing battle to me, because they are working against the Mormon scriptures. They're working against the example of Joseph Smith. They're working against the entire fabric of Mormonism in trying to do that, because Mormonism takes misogyny and patriarchy and levels it up. We literally in our like deepest doctrines, like most sacred spaces in the temple, we have enshrined the patriarchal grip, the patriarchal order. The patriarchy is the idol at the center of Mormonism. And when I say patriarchy, I'm not just talking about male supremacy, because our particular system of patriarchy is also rooted in heavy racism, homophobia, and superiority over other men too. So this is the theory that like some men are superior to most other men, all queer people, and all women. Thus, I kind of fall on the side of John Larson now when he says that in Mormonism, women and children are possessions. Men are rewarded with women in heaven. There's this huge superiority complex, and the church treats people in textbook abusive ways, including protecting abusers and even encouraging or promoting abusers when they discover those abuses. The important thing to remember here is that that kind of conditioning doesn't just go away because you've had a faith crisis about the church. This kind of conditioning is going to take years of active deconstruction to get out of your system. And that applies to women and men, that both men and women, that queer members and racial minorities, that we all have this internalized patriarchy, this internalized white male church superiority complex downloaded into us. And it's going to take some work to deconstruct that. So I guess this is my plea, that wherever you fall in that pyramid scheme, don't stop deconstructing. Keep going. Keep going. I have other stuff to talk about this morning, but can we spend a second just talking about White Mormon Jesus. This has come up kind of regularly in Reddit subs and in Facebook groups, so I just want to spend a minute talking about it. Sometimes you see articles on LDS living like this, which are very progressive and nuanced and scientifically minded, talking about how he probably had olive skin complexion and was about 5 feet tall. They speculate on what he looked like, his hygienic practices. He probably had a full beard, short hair, blah, blah, blah. These scientific statements notwithstanding, the church just released this list of approved artworks for church foyers, for church buildings. And if you've been in this space for more than 20 seconds, you probably know that church artists don't just spontaneously draw or paint whatever comes to their mind as the most spiritual representation of Jesus. They're heavily monitored by the church authorities, from their sketches all the way to their final paintings, and that if they don't do what the general authorities want, that the general authorities will hire someone else to come in and change the painting like they did for that Second Coming painting. They commissioned that painting, but the artist drew wings on the angels, and so the wings had to be replaced with like flowing cloth. Most people know that story, right? But anyway, back to Jesus. You'll notice something strangely consistent about all of these pictures. Can you see what it is? It's that Jesus is white in all of them. So the general authorities, who have all, except for in the past like 2-ish years since Ulysses Suarez and Garrett Gong joined the group, have been white men, have commissioned white artists, and insisted on painting white men. And they say, this is Jesus. Did they just make this up? Were they going on something else? Well, like most things in church doctrine, policy, etc., it is an absolute mess of contradictions. And so you can find things like this lay apologist's response to the question of why Jesus is always pictured as being white with blue eyes. And he does a bunch of mental gymnastics around like, oh, well, we don't really know what he looked like. And he probably wasn't really black, even though they called them black Jews, because that was actually in reference to their hair. And the eye color of ancient Jews could be blue sometimes. But after he does all of these, like weird gymnastics, he comes to Del Parson's statement about painting Jesus. Let's keep going with White Mormon Jesus, starting with Del Parson. So this is from the lay apologist Ask Gramps. He's quoting Del Parson, who says, when I'm painting the Savior, I'm going for emotion more than anything else. When they, the viewers, see the painting, they see the Savior. I did the best I could to create the painting with what I had. I got some material and wrapped it around a model and painted it. The last thing I was worried about was whether the robe was at the right level of the neck. The whole thing I was worried about was, can they feel the Savior? I'm sure it's just because it's spiritually accurate, right? That a white man painting his Savior would think of him as white. It's just probably accurate, right? Sorry. I know sarcasm is hard for some stages of your faith crisis, but like this is kind of ridiculous. It's right. It's ridiculous that we that we thought it was just okay to paint to emotion. That we thought it was okay for all of these white men to dictate to mostly white men artists and some white women to paint white Jesus and say like, well, I felt good while looking at it, so that must be the best representation of Jesus. Just, ugh. But anyway, to round out our sampling of what members think that Jesus looked like, you get people like Celia M., a lifelong LDS person on Quora, saying, well, I can't speak for every Latter-day Saint, but then she goes ahead to say like what she thinks most LDS saints believe. She doesn't think that most people believe that Jesus had blue eyes. Then a couple of comments later, we get a very detailed analysis, including some church history quotes, which I'll use in a second, from Clay Pendleton, who says that he also can't speak for what most members believe, but that he doesn't just believe that Jesus had blue eyes, he had aquamarine blue eyes. Okay, but seriously, you should go and look this up on Quora because these comments are just fascinating. This particular comment from Clay, though, I appreciate because he does base it in LDS history. And while the rest of the more nuanced progressive Mormons are basing their ideas on something like science, the more traditional Mormons base their opinions on revelation. And this comment specifically references Zebedee Coltrane about some conversations that he'd had with the prophet and about visions that he had had himself of seeing Jesus as the most lovely, visage like the sun. He had bright silver gray hair, keen penetrating blue eyes, and very white skin. And once you start to get into the revealed versions of what Jesus looked like, all of a sudden, all of these church arts makes sense because people like Orson F. Whitney are describing him as of noble stature and majestic mien, not at all weak and effeminate as some painters have portrayed, as if there's something wrong with being effeminate. And here we go with part 3 on White Mormon Jesus. If you dig on just about any of these issues long enough, eventually you're gonna hit bedrock, and by that I mean you're gonna find quotes or secondhand quotes from Joseph Smith. This one comes through Alexander Niebuhr, a convert who gathered with the saints in Nauvoo. He described in his journal what Joseph told him during a dinner conversation. Brother Niebuhr wrote that the prophet said he had been struck by a passage on prayer in the Bible and so went into the woods to pray. After his tongue cleaved temporarily to the roof of his mouth, which possibly could have been caused by psychedelics if you'll see my much earlier videos on Joseph Smith and mushrooms. Anyway, he saw fire which gradually drew nearer to him, also a symptom of psychedelics. He saw a personage in the fire, light complexion, blue eyes. You can find this article on the church's app or website. This is what it's called. And if you start digging around on Google, you can find all kinds of other visionary experiences, secondhand accounts, journals, other things, talking about the descriptions of Jesus. Some of them reference direct conversations with Joseph Smith. Some of them reference conversations with other apostles or other church leaders conveying what they had heard from Joseph Smith. Some of them talk about personal visions, such as Orson F. Whitney. And some of them just go straight to D&C, where Joseph Smith describes the Savior as being like having flaming fire eyes and white hair and beautiful, exalted robes, etc. This all leads to the question, what does it matter if Jesus looked like this? Or like this? This is something that kind of came up when we were comparing the historical renditions of what Joseph Smith actually looked like versus the way that the church portrays him now, in that he's much better looking now, much slimmer and trimmer, much more charismatic in the current church portrayals than he was in the contemporary portraits of the time. And it looks like the same is being done with Jesus, maybe at a much, much grander scale. I think there are a lot of layers to this question, but most simply, this is a device that all propagandists have used to promote their causes, is to take their leaders and kind of fetishize them to make them more good-looking, more charismatic, more glorious, more perfect, so that their cult followers or their cult-minded followers will do anything for them, be violent for them, do injustice on others for them. In the LDS context specifically, I think this introduces another element too, which is that if we try to combine all of these theories and say that Joseph looked like a Middle Eastern man during his life, but then he was resurrected as this white man, that shows us something about the way that LDS people think about perfection and exaltation. To sum up about White Mormon Jesus, I really don't think there is a problem with depicting Jesus in a way that is reflective of your own life experience or your own, set of racial characteristics. However, when you have a top-down authority structure with the top authority figures all looking a certain way, and then you insist that your images of deity, who are the most powerful person in the universe, and remember, of course, Heavenly Father, Elohim, looks just like Jesus, right? We also get that from Joseph Smith. So this isn't just depictions of Jesus, this is depictions of Jesus and Elohim. And we have no other depictions of deity. No black Jesuses, no brown Jesuses, no female divinities. This is it. That's a problem. can you feel why that's a problem? I'm assuming if you're in the ex-Mormon group that you can. That this is probably one of the reasons that you decided to become an ex-Mormon. If you're not in the ex-Mormon group, if you're in the gray in-between, if you're in the PMO group, if you're still in the church for some reason, can you feel how problematic this is? There is a concern right now in the publishing world that not enough minority races or women or queer folks are being represented in literature and in art, in children's books, etc. And the representation that children see of themselves, or rather the representation that children see in their media, has a huge impact on their well-being, on their sense of self, on their sense of security and identity. Thus, it's no surprise that little white boys who are, demographically speaking, way overrepresented in our media feel pretty secure about themselves. They may feel insecure for other reasons, but they don't necessarily feel insecure in their media. Where other races, girls, their representation is much more limited. They're usually confined to certain roles in these media, where the white boys are allowed more self-expression. Now, we are in a time of transition where that is changing, and that's great. But this same problem applies to representations of deity, which is why I don't think it's a problem that we have a white Mormon Jesus. I think the problem is that we only have a white Mormon Jesus, and that we're not allowing for representations of the divine feminine, black and brown and queer divine feminines, that we're not allowing for representations of black and brown and queer Jesus. We don't know what he looked like in life, so let's just let all of the representations of humanity be reflected there. You know, I really like a lot of things about TikTok, but one of its weaknesses is that the videos are so short that it's hard to explain kind of complex ideas. So let me try this again. In the LDS Church, we have two functions for Jesus. We have Jesus as a historical figure, and we have Jesus as a spiritual symbol. Jesus, the historical figure, was a first century Semite Jewish man. Probably something like this. I feel like this interpretation is really nice because it communicates that he doesn't have to be supermodel good looking to have a magnetic presence. Like this model or this rendering or this artist managed to capture something of like a kindness in the face that makes him really feel warm and inviting, even if he's not supermodel good looking. In the early church, however, a lot of key leaders, including, it seems, Joseph Smith, Orson F. Whitney, several other apostles and later presidents of the church, had visions in which they described a Jesus with very white skin and blue eyes and Caucasian features and manly stature, etc. I'm going to call him White Mormon Jesus. And when artists or general authorities have presented this picture of Jesus, usually their justification for describing how he looks is that he is a spiritual symbol and that they're communicating who Jesus is spiritually. The problem that we have in the church is that we've taken some white men's spiritual symbol for who they imagine Jesus to be, and we have placed that in historical context, and in fact required and restricted the representations of the historical Jesus to only reflect this supposedly spiritual symbol. And when it is challenged, the church says, oh, we have no position on what Jesus looked like. He was probably a first century Jewish man. But in practice, they're justifying what they describe as a spiritual symbol in historical representation, which is not only inaccurate, but propagandistic, because it reinforces the racism that is already rampant in the church and reinforces the white male supremacy that is so rampant in the church. So I think when we're talking about historical Jesus, we should be talking about a first century Semite Jewish man. And if we're talking about a spiritual Jesus, I'm fine with white Mormon Jesus being one of those representations. But we should also be able to have other creative representations of deity if we're talking about spiritual symbols. Because in Christianity, the theory is that heaven is big enough for everyone. And so there should be room enough for everyone to have representation there.